Hi guys, so the former Labour MP and founder of your party, Zarah Sultana, appeared on the Nick Robinson show where she was talking about Nigel Farage and fascism. Now, she compared the Reform UK leader to a fascist, and then Nick Robinson went a step further and used this comparison to three of the worst people in history, which is actually a dangerous misrepresentation of the threat that Nigel Farage really poses, which I'll explain in just a moment.
I do think he has all the features of a fascist politician, and I think it's important that we stop a fascist reform government.
Fascist?
When someone attacks trade union rights, when they are not supportive of minority communities, where they are trying to get us out of the ECHR so they can get away with anything and there is no state accountability, we can see what's happening across Europe, and that is a descent into fascism.
You're comparing Nigel Farage with Franco, with Mussolini, arguably with Adolf Hitler. Really?
I have legitimate concerns about what a Nigel Farage government would do to trade unionists, to working class communities, to minority communities, to LGBT people. And what I've seen in government is Nigel Farage and his colleagues, like I said, vote against trade union rights, vote against anything that would actually help our working class communities. So yes, he's a danger.
Okay, so I agree with everything she said here, 100%. The problem, of course, was the response to Nick Robinson's ridiculous comparison. What she should have said is, no, I'm not comparing Nigel Farage to Hitler, Mussolini, or Franco, because that would be absurd. It's absolutely absurd, because they represent fascism in the 1930s. Nigel Farage, if you compare him to Hitler or Mussolini or Franco, could easily respond, and rightly so, by saying, well, I don't dress in a uniform. I don't wave my arms around in the air. I don't organise thugs in the street to beat people up or to burn down buildings. I'm not putting people in camps. I have no intention of putting people in camps. That's the response that Farage could have if you compare him to fascists from the 1930s. It's absurd, and it's dangerously absurd. It makes more sense to compare him to somebody like this guy. This is Viktor Orbán, who is the Prime Minister of Hungary. Now, is he a fascist? Well, like with Nigel Farage, let's have a look at what he's been up to. So, Viktor Orbán, remember, Hungary is a member of the European Union, and the European Union, or the European Community, its original name, was set up in order to stop the rise of fascism once again in Europe. So, the European Union is pretty strict when it comes to stopping fascism and making sure measures are in place to maintain the opposite of fascism. So freedom, for example. So the EU has accused Orbán's government of eroding checks and balances by concentrating power in the executive branch and weakening the independence of courts and constitutional institutions. In 2018, the European Union passed a resolution to trigger Article 7, highlighting the systematic threats to democracy and fundamental rights in Hungary. In 2022, it withheld billions of EU funds due to rule of law deficiencies, especially concerning corruption and judicial independence in Hungary. But it goes beyond just justice and democracy. It also covers press, the freedom of the press and freedom of expression. The EU has said that Hungary's media landscape is no longer independent. The European Commission has warned that consolidation of power within Hungary and its control of the media violates freedom principles. And the European Parliament has regularly cited Hungary in reports in declining media freedom in the European Union. In 2020, the European Court of Justice ruled against Hungary's restrictive treatment of independent news outlets and NGOs operating in the country who were receiving funding from abroad. When it comes to minority rights and human rights, the EU has condemned Hungary's policies targeting LGBTQ plus people, migrants and civil society organizations. In 2021, Hungary passed a law banning the promotion of homosexuality, and the EU called it a violation of human rights and dignity and equality. The the European Union has, the European Court of Justice in 2022 ruled that Hungary had broken EU asylum rules by denying asylum seekers access to protection. And then when it comes to corruption, something that Nigel Farage doesn't really have a problem with, the EU has long accused Hungary of misusing EU money through networks of cronies and politically connected firms. In 2022, the European Commission suspended €6.3 billion in cohesion funds until Hungary implemented the rule of law reforms. So there are a number of issues here. And Nigel Farage wants to emulate people like Viktor Orbán because he sees these are people who are able to run their countries as they wish. They don't have to follow the rules. They don't have to listen to what Brussels is saying. Brussels, of course, wants to implement measures that protect human rights, the rights of minorities, the rights of asylum seekers, the rule of law, the freedom of the press. It wants to implement these and maintain them in countries that are members of the European Union. But of course, Orbán is not interested in playing ball there. He wants the money, but he doesn't want to relinquish his powers. And Nigel Farage is probably more dangerous than Viktor Orbán, because at least Orbán has to operate somewhat within the European Union framework. The UK, of course, is no longer a member of the European Union, so Nigel Farage will be much freer to implement whatever the hell he wanted. So I think it's important when we're comparing Nigel Farage or describing him as a fascist, not to compare him to people from the 1930s, but to compare him with people of today, like Viktor Orbán, Vladimir Putin, and maybe even Donald Trump. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.